When we move into human history, we see, if you take a look at, say, for example, from the ancient Egyptians to modern America, we see a general pattern of increasing complexity. This pattern really begins to take off with agriculture. I want you to consider the fact that agriculture, the use of farming as the primary means by which a society manages and achieves the needs of its own individual members, it created both the possibility and the necessity for more complex societies, meaning it made it possible to become more complex, but it also made it necessary. Let's talk about possibilities first. Farming made more complex societies possible because agricultural communities would free about 10% of the population from being food producers. In hunting and gathering societies, everybody was involved in the process of hunting and gathering. But with agriculture being a more productive way of using human power to achieve the primary needs of the economy, 10% of the population were free to pursue other types of activities. They could invent things like the wheel or better pottery, better plows. There's also people that would look at the stars in the skies. They became known as priests and developed important innovations like calendars that helped agricultural societies know when was the best time to plant and the predictability of weather. And of course, attempting to appease the gods so that the land would be fertile. Others would involve as merchants. Their job was not to produce anything, but to simply find where a certain crop might have been cheap and plentiful, and moving it to where it was expensive and rare, allowing for economic interdependence. And they would keep a profit for themselves, making merchants a pretty profitable, a higher class than the farmers from whom they traded. Agricultural communities would engage in productive contact with other societies, the idea of trade not only within but between societies. We see examples of societies going hundreds of miles for precious stones, or for timber, or for the needs of whatever need their society might have, since no area has all the raw materials and all the ability to produce the things that people need on their own. So this is going to promote something called cultural diffusion. This is an important vocabulary word you've already read. The cultural diffusion is the idea that when different societies come in contact, they don't just share, for example, the goods that they're going to trade, but they share cultural ideas and new technologies, whether it's the wheel or new types of pottery or weaving new types of fabric or even cultivating different crops that might be native to different areas. That these things would spread by the contact and allowing for societies to develop a richer variety and more possible survival strategies as they face the changing environment. That's cultural diffusion. That's an important concept for us here. But not only did it provide possibility, it also was necessary. Farming requires the specialization of labor, that farmers have to have someone from which to trade. Societies grew more complex because, where the Yanomami knew exactly where their food was coming from, they were all involved in its production. Farmers would specialize on one or two different crops, and a farmer could not plow without a metal worker or somebody who would make his plow for him. That the farmer depended on people to protect him, the military, so he had to pay taxes. Society became a lot more complex as societies became more specialized. We see the specialization of different groups. We talked about merchants, and there are artisans, and these people not only developed better at their skills, developing more advanced technology, but they also needed to be maintained. The idea was, if I'm a higher class person, what's going to enforce or protect my wealth and status in society? Well, that's something we will call law. And that's going to be, even then, the idea of the administration of law and justice becomes a specialization. These societies don't have informal laws anymore. We're going to see the first written law in the ancient world. We're going to look at those a little bit later. Farming involved trade outside of society and interdependence within societies, requiring everything from the idea of a system of weights and measures, like we could agree on how much gold is this so that I know how many cows is worth a measure of gold. Farming involved the accumulation of wealth, which means there's a necessity of protecting it, not just from your neighbors who are jealous of your accumulation of wealth if you're a successful merchant, but among your people living outside of your society, potential invaders. This is going to create the necessity of the state, a government, and an army, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. Farming also involved the issue of property ownership and property rights. That a farmer who sowed the land wanted to be able to harvest it, and how would the property rights be surveyed and protected? Irrigation ditches were things that required communication and a shared sense of responsibility for their creation and maintenance. Temples, too, which might seem superfluous to us, was the window of the natural world that the farmer needed to know when to plant and when to harvest. The early priests were also scientists. They looking into the stars, into the sky, astrologists still do that today, attempted to try to determine when you should plant and when you should harvest, and all kind of important information that we might consider part of the farmer's almanac today. It was really priests who really were the first scientists in human history, as they attempted to try to understand and manage the environment. And of course, farmers depended on that. So why was farming an irresistible choice? One is compared to hunters and gatherers, agricultural societies had a more dependable food supply. They could store in times of famine, where hunters and gatherers were living day to day. An agricultural area could support more complex social organizations. And with more complex social organizations, they could develop stronger institutions like militaries and better technology that allows them to overcome any hunters and gatherers from whom they come in contact. So essentially, they're more complex, they're stronger, they're more resilient. Agriculture would also concentrate more wealth and greater social solidarity than other kinds of societies. It could a agricultural society could be larger, and they would use symbols like in architecture and religion that drove people together to feel themselves as being really the first like proto nations. The idea of belonging to something bigger than your family or to an organic band. The greatest challenge to agricultural societies, however, were other types of people who were called pastoralists. They weren't hunters and gatherers. Pastoralists domesticated animals, but instead of penning them up and having a barn and harvesting grain, they essentially moved onto great grasslands, sometimes known as steppes, and they would live off their animals. They would live off their furs, they would live off their milk, they would live off their meat, and also they became expert horsemen. They were never developed as wealthy as society as agriculturalists. They didn't build great monuments and pyramids and public works, but they were more mobile. And a few pastoral societies also remain today. A group, for example, called the Laplanders live in northern Norway. If you ever saw the movie Frozen, it kind of alludes a little bit to the Laplanders in that movie, at least indirectly. So here's your question. This is number 4. Stop it when you're done. How did farming generate a slow chain reaction of events that would increase the complexity of human communities? So really, how did farming make societies? It gave them the opportunity and the need to become more complex than their ancestors as hunters and gatherers. All right, let's take a look at the next one. What kind of culture evolved in early agricultural societies? Well, these agricultural societies obviously would have a great interest in understanding nature. They needed to predict the seasons, they needed to predict the weather, they need to have a working knowledge about how the earth worked, and they oftentimes did it in what we might call it religion today. They saw the power of fertility, the power of, and religion would be used, and astrology was used to kind of help these human societies navigate an uncertain world where floods and famines would come and go, plagues and all these types of things. Without science, they used religion to try to attempt to understand and maybe to master the forces that they were living under. Farming would free up some people, like we mentioned before, and specialists. There are people called artisans who created goods by hand. We could see pottery or jewelry or tools. Merchants would move surplus goods, whether it was an artisan craft or a farming produce, to where it was for profit. Of course, we need soldiers to protect these communities. And then we have priests who were early on were political and science leaders of ancient society. And people became increasingly interdependent. The interdependence grew from a group of 20 to 40 to numbers that might number in the thousands. And their way of life was increasingly linked to their efforts of others. And we talk about social stratification. In these societies, unlike the Paleolithic, where most everyone was equal, we have very rich and powerful people, and we have relatively poor and powerless people. At the very bottom, you have slavery. Slavery did not exist in Paleolithic societies. It requires the force of government to keep it in force, and social stratification would not be a factor in the earliest societies. But we see slavery in such levels of where some people were rich and powerful and others were poor. It begins in the Neolithic era with farming. We also see the beginning of government. Government would be needed to manage things like irrigation that were vital for the welfare of the people, and disputes between people who were living in the same region and shared property. They had also developed and support armies that were needed to defend against invaders. They would organize knowledge of farming and try to make the gods happy so that they would have good harvests. They collected revenue, and that was to support these activities. This was the early use of tax money, usually taken in the form of grain to the temple. And of course, that would be something that would allow the highest level of society to live well. And they could trade that grain for all the riches and jewelry that would put them on the top of society. Early leaders were probably priests and claimed that the gods had given them secret knowledge and allowed them to direct rituals that kept the society healthy and happy. Governments could organize resources to build public works. Again, it could also build solidarity. We need to build, for example, an irrigation ditch, and that means that we all have to work together so we could all live better. And that draws people together along with religion. And so we see now the birth of civilization. Civilization, we talked about, and it's in the reading. I kind of took down the number of points that the text has, and I broke it down to 4. That societies that had developed farming had reached a level of complexity that to the point where we call it civilization. We see developed government. They need to manage the stratification and the accumulated wealth. They have to organize tax dollars and the military forces needed to keep the society safe from others. They also had these governments directed the complex religions. Religion and government were tied to the same factor. This idea we attempt to separate it in modern world is somewhat unusual in the breadth of history. You read people like Moses in the Bible, they were lawgivers, they were leaders, they were priest kings. And they used God to give, as they were the intermediaries between God who gives them the rules and the people who are going to be ruled over. It provides societal discipline. Another factor is the division of labor and trade. Farming surplus allows for the specialization of occupations and the movement of goods between people and communities, and it's also going to create stratification, as I mentioned. Cities. That's a third factor, that farmers were sedentary, and by the time these villages grew to such a size, because they grew so as powerful and rich centers of culture, these cities became one of the hallmarks of civilization. They all come from the same Latin word, civus, civitatis. It means a member of a society or a city. Symbols of society include art and architecture, and they're used to bind people together. And fourth is the thing that really draws us into the period we know as history. It's the development of writing. It's a vital technology that allows us for the first time to think and see and understand the words and ideas of civilization beyond the artifacts they create. We could see their words for the first time. So question 5, how did farming generate a slow chain reaction of events that would increase the complexity of human communities? You see a picture here of Egyptian farming in progress. So how did farming generate a slow chain reaction of events that would eventually create societies in a much more complex way? The birth of writing. Humans were creative creatures, as we mentioned, and thousands of years before this we had the first spoken language. But writing grew out of the need to record agricultural contacts and trade. It evolved from pictographic writing, and it grew more abstract to the point where in order to be able to write it and to read it, you had to be a specialist, like an artisan or a farmer. You had to learn how to do it. Those people were called scribes. You see on the top you have Egyptian hieroglyphics, which you may have seen before, where it means nothing to us today. To the ancient Egyptian scribe, it meant a lot. In the bottom you have Akkadian cuneiform. It was a different form of writing that was used in the Middle East. We'll talk more about those later on. Writing about religious text and legal text became common over time. It provided the function of accumulating knowledge for these ancient societies, but it also gives historians a window in what these people knew and how they thought. Historians consider writing the beginning of history. Here's, for example, how writing developed from early pictographs to complex ideas of cuneiform. So writing, like many aspects of culture, would evolve over time. So here's the last question. Why is writing such an important development in human society? And this is Harappan writing from India, which we still can't read today. We'll talk more about this later, but place your answer in a complete sentence from the document associated with activity 3. Why is writing important? Show me that by doing a good job on this answer. Good work, folks. We'll talk to you later.